Welcome back to Plain Sight Docs. There's a comfort we feel in the quiet, in the sound of gravel crunching under tires on a country road, in the hum of a streetlight over an empty parking lot, in the stillness of a small town where everyone knows your name. But that comfort is a lie. Because in the heart of rural America, far from the city lights, the sirens, the noise, some of the most brutal and baffling crimes in modern history have taken place. Not in dark alleys or gang territories, but in bowling alleys, campgrounds, mobile homes, places where families gathered, where teenagers worked late shifts, where children slept under canvas tents beneath the stars. And in each case, something went terribly, inexplicably wrong. Tonight, we're pulling back the veil on 7 unsolved massacres that shattered the myth of the safe small town. These aren't ghost stories. They're real investigations. Real victims. Real evidence that led nowhere. And real killers who walk back into the night. They may still be out there. This is a journey into the places we're taught to trust. The wide open spaces. The neighborly smiles. The unlocked doors. But the strangest part, in some of these cases, investigators believe the answers were always hiding in plain sight. This is Plain Sight Docs. The silence in the trailer. Ena, Illinois doesn't show up on most maps. It's a village of about 2,000 people tucked into the flatlands of southern Illinois, where the earth stretches out in every direction: cornfields, gravel roads, and trailer homes sitting like islands in a sea of crops. The sky here feels bigger than it should. The silence, heavier. In November of 1987, the Dardeen family called one of those trailers home. Keith Dardeen was 27. Quiet. Dependable. He worked the night shift at the Wren Lake water treatment plant, a job that required him to show up on time, monitor equipment, and stay alert through the early morning hours. His wife, Elaine, was 29 and 8 months pregnant with their second child. Their son, Peter, was just 2 years old, a toddler still learning the world through wide eyes and small hands. They lived in a mobile home off Old Broughton Road, a narrow stretch of asphalt that cuts through endless fields. At night, there were no streetlights. No neighbors within shouting distance. Just the rustling of dry corn stalks and the occasional headlights of a passing truck. The trailer itself was modest, a single wide with aluminum siding that rattled when the wind picked up. Inside, it was warm, lived in, hot. There were toys scattered on the carpet, dishes in the sink, a small television in the corner. The kind of home where a young family was just starting out, building a life one paycheck at a time. But the isolation was absolute. If you stood on the front steps and looked in any direction, all you'd see was corn. Rows and rows of it, tall enough in the summer to block the horizon, but by November, dried and skeletal, rattling like bones in the wind. It was, by all accounts, the kind of place where nothing ever happened. Until it did. On the morning of November 18th, Keith didn't show up for work. That wasn't like him. His supervisor called the trailer. No answer. He called again an hour later. Still nothing. By mid-morning, concern turned to alarm. A co-worker drove out to the Dardeen home expecting to find a broken-down car or a family emergency. What he found was silence. The trailer sat crooked on its foundation, its skirting sagging in places. The front door was unlocked. He knocked. No response. He opened the door and stepped inside. The scene that greeted him would haunt investigators for decades. Elaine Dardeen was in the bedroom, lying on the floor near the bed. She had been bound. Beaten. The blunt force trauma to her head was so severe that her skull had been shattered in multiple places. Beside her, in a pool of blood, was her newborn daughter, a baby girl who had been born during the attack. She had been bludgeoned to death within minutes of taking her first breath. In the hallway, investigators found Peter. The 2-year-old had been killed with the same weapon, a baseball bat, they believed, or something similar. The force used was described by the coroner as overkill, the kind of violence that goes beyond murder and enters the realm of rage. But Keith was missing. The co-worker who found the scene immediately backed out and called the police. Within the hour, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department had cordoned off the trailer. The gravel driveway became a staging area for detectives, forensic techs, and crime scene photographers who moved in and out of the narrow doorway, their faces pale and tight. The scene inside was methodical in its horror. Blood spatter patterns suggested Elaine had been attacked in the bedroom, likely while she was sleeping or resting. The bindings on her wrists were tight. Zip ties, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. She had been restrained before the beating began. And then she went into labor. It's unclear whether the stress of the attack induced labor or whether it had begun naturally and the killer simply continued. But the baby, a girl later named Casey, was delivered there on the floor of that blood-soaked bedroom. The umbilical cord was still attached when investigators found her. The killer had waited for the baby to be born, and then killed her too. For 2 days, the search focused on the fields surrounding the trailer. Volunteers combed through rows of dead corn. Helicopters scanned the tree lines. And then, on November 20th, a farmer in a pickup truck noticed something near an abandoned grain silo, about 30 miles away, just over the county line in Dahlgren. It was Keith's car, a rusty sedan left on the side of a dirt access road. His body was inside the trunk. The autopsy revealed a level of violence that investigators struggled to articulate in their reports. Keith had been shot in the head, execution style. But before that, he had been subjected to what forensic psychologists would later describe as sexually sadistic mutilation. His genitals had been removed. There were signs of torture. The positioning of the body suggested the killer had taken time with him. The coroner's report was clinical, but those who read it described it as one of the most disturbing documents they'd ever encountered. The mutilation wasn't random. It was deliberate, controlled. The killer had used a sharp instrument, likely a knife, and had performed the acts while Keith was still alive. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal, methodical, and deeply, disturbingly controlled. The timeline. Investigators worked backward. Keith had left for work on the night of November 17th, around 11 p.m. He never made it. His car was found abandoned the next morning, but his body wasn't discovered until 2 days later. That meant the killer had time. Time to intercept Keith on his way to work. Time to subdue him, torture him, kill him, and dump his body. Time to return to the trailer. Time to wait for Elaine and Peter. Time to orchestrate a massacre inside a home where a pregnant woman and a toddler had no chance of escape. The brutality against Elaine suggested she had been the primary target, or at least the focus of the killer's rage. But the newborn complicated everything. Elaine had gone to labor during the attack. She had given birth, likely in terror, while the killer was still in the trailer, and the baby was killed immediately. You might wonder how someone could do that. How a person could stand over a newborn, minutes old, still covered in blood and vernix, and choose violence. The answer, investigators believed, lay in the psychology of the killer. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a crime of elimination. The killer didn't want witnesses, didn't want loose ends, and he had all night to make sure there weren't any. But here's what kept detectives awake at night. The timeline required an almost impossible level of planning. The killer had to know Keith's schedule, had to know when he'd be driving that dark, empty stretch of road to the water plant, had to know Elaine would be alone in the trailer. That suggested familiarity, knowledge, Access. It suggested someone local. Forensic teams spent days processing the trailer. They found fingerprints, but most belonged to the family or known visitors. They found fibers, hairs, trace evidence, but in 1987, DNA analysis was still in its infancy. The samples were cataloged and stored, waiting for technology to catch up. What they didn't find was a murder weapon. The baseball bat, or whatever blunt instrument had been used, was never recovered. That suggested the killer had brought it with him and taken it when he left. They also didn't find signs of forced entry. The front door had been unlocked. That wasn't unusual in rural Illinois in 1987. Many families didn't bother locking their doors. But it also meant the killer could have walked right in, or been invited in. One detail stood out: a single boot print, found in the dirt outside the trailer's back door. It was a size 10, possibly a work boot. But the print was partial, smudged, and couldn't be matched to any known brand or pattern. Still, it was evidence that someone had stood there, watching, waiting. Ina was a place where people didn't lock their doors, where neighbors helped neighbors, where violence was something that happened in the cities, not in the cornfields. The Dardine murders shattered that illusion. Parents stopped letting their children play outside unsupervised. Doors were locked. Guns were loaded and kept by bedsides. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. The town fractured into those who believed the killer was an outsider, someone passing through, and those who believed the killer was one of them. Church attendance spiked in the weeks after the murders. People needed answers, needed comfort, needed to believe that this level of evil could be explained, contained, understood. But it couldn't. For years, the Dardine murders were a black hole of leads. Local rumors swirled. Some said Keith owed money to the wrong people. Drug debts, maybe, tied to the meth trade that was quietly poisoning rural Illinois in the late 80s. Others whispered about jealous ex-boyfriends, scorned lovers, men who had fixated on Elaine. Detectives ran down every tip. They interviewed Keith's co-workers, Elaine's friends, distant relatives. They looked at recently paroled violent offenders in the area. They cross-referenced similar crimes in neighboring states, but nothing stuck. The case went cold. Files were boxed up and stored in the basement of the sheriff's office. The Dardine family was buried. The trailer was eventually torn down. And the killer, whoever he was, disappeared into the silence of the Illinois fields. Then, in 2010, a name surfaced that sent a chill through the investigative community. Tommy Lynn Sells. Sells was a drifter, a serial killer who roamed the highways and backroads of America for decades, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. He had no pattern, no type, no motive beyond opportunity and impulse. He killed men, women, children. Anyone who happened to be in the wrong place when his rage surfaced. He was a ghost, a predator who moved through the American landscape like a shadow, striking without warning and vanishing without a trace. And in the months before his execution in Texas, Sells began confessing to unsolved murders across the country. One of them was the Dardine family. He claimed he had been in Illinois in November 1987. Said he'd seen the trailer. Said he'd gone inside. His description of the scene matched details that had never been released to the public. The positioning of the bodies, the use of a blunt object, the newborn. Investigators were stunned. Could this be the break they'd been waiting for? The confession problem. But then the inconsistencies emerged. Sells had a history of false confessions. He was a narcissist who craved attention, and he knew that each new confession bought him more time, more interviews, more control over his narrative. Some of the murders he claimed were later disproven with alibis or conflicting evidence, and in the Dardine case, there were gaps. Sells couldn't explain how he had moved Keith's body 30 miles away. He didn't have a car at the time, at least, not one that could be traced. He couldn't describe the inside of the trailer beyond what might have been inferred from crime scene photos or media reports. When pressed on specifics, what time of night he arrived, what route he took, what Keith was wearing, Sells became vague, evasive. He'd say things like, "I don't remember exactly. It was a long time ago." Or it all blurs together after a while. That wasn't unusual for a serial killer. Memory fades. Details merge. But for a crime as specific and brutal as the Dardine murders, investigators expected more. And most critically, the DNA evidence didn't match. The town. Speedway, Indiana is built on noise. It's a town that exists because of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the legendary racetrack that roars to life every May with the Indy 500. The streets smell like motor oil and burnt rubber. The bars are filled with mechanics and gearheads. The entire identity of the place is speed, adrenaline, and the controlled chaos of machines pushing their limits. The town sits just west of Indianapolis proper, connected by a maze of industrial roads and suburban sprawl. In 1978, it was blue-collar through and through. Factory workers, service industry employees, families scraping by on modest incomes. The kind of place where people worked hard, kept their heads down, and didn't expect much beyond a steady paycheck and a cold beer on Friday night. But on the night of November 17, 1978, the horror in Speedway was quiet. Chillingly. Impossibly quiet. The restaurant. The Burger Chef on Crawfordsville Road was a typical fast food joint. Bright fluorescent lights, orange and brown decor. A menu dominated by burgers, fries, and milkshakes. It wasn't fancy, but it was steady work for the 4 employees scheduled to close that Friday night. Jane Freed, 20, was the assistant manager. Responsible. Organized. The kind of person you could count on to lock up properly and make sure the register's balanced. She'd been working at the Burger Chef for over a year, and management was grooming her for a promotion. She was studying business at a local community college, taking night classes when her schedule allowed. Her co-workers described her as firm but fair. Someone who didn't tolerate slacking, but who also had your back if you needed help. Ruth Shelton, 17, was a high school senior. She worked weekends to save money for college. Bright, bubbly, popular. She was on the cheerleading squad and had been accepted to Indiana University for the fall. Her parents were proud. She was going to be the first in her family to get a degree. Daniel Davis, 16, was the kitchen kid. Quiet, hardworking, still learning the ropes. He'd only been working at the Burger Chef for a few months. He was shy, kept to himself, but was dependable. He showed up on time, did his job, and never complained. His dream was to save enough money to buy a car. Mark Flemons, also 16, was the newest hire. It was only his second week on the job. He was still figuring out the routines, still learning where everything was kept, still nervous about messing up. But his coworkers liked him. He was polite, eager, the kind of kid who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. By 11 p.m., the dining room was empty. The last customers had trickled out around 10:30. The 4 of them moved through the familiar routine, wiping down tables, draining the fryers, counting the cash. The plan was to be out by midnight. They never made it. At 12:15 a.m., another employee, a young man named Brian Crane, arrived to pick up his paycheck. He was running late, knew the place would be closed, but figured he'd knock on the back door and catch someone before they left. The back door was wide open. He stepped inside, calling out their names. No response. The lights were still on. The fryers were still bubbling with oil, even though protocol required them to be shut off before closing. The registers were open, money still inside, though some bills were scattered on the floor. And the safe in the office was ajar. But the 4 employees were gone. Ryan walked through the kitchen, the office, the storage room. He checked the bathrooms. Nothing. The building was empty. He stepped back outside and scanned the parking lot. Jane's car, a tan Chevrolet Vega, was still parked near the side entrance. So were Ruth's purse, which she'd left hanging on a hook in the office, and Daniel's jacket, draped over a chair. No one leaves their car, their belongings, their paycheck, and just disappears. Unless they didn't leave willingly. Brian called the police. Officers arrived within minutes, expecting a prank or a joyride. Maybe the teenagers had gotten spooked by something and bolted. But the scene didn't add up. The investigation begins. Initially, Speedway police treated it as a missing persons case. They theorized that the four had left together, maybe gone to a party, maybe been picked up by friends. But the open registers and the scattered cash suggested something more sinister. A robbery. Still, the first 48 hours were consumed by hope. Families waited by their phones. Tips poured in. Someone thought they'd seen Jane's car on the highway. Someone else claimed to have spotted the group at a gas station. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood. They interviewed the customers who'd been in the restaurant that night. They reviewed the timeline. The last confirmed sighting of the four employees alive was around 11 p.m. when a customer had ordered a milkshake at the drive-through window. Jane had handed him his change and wished him a good night. That was the last time anyone saw them. But none of it led anywhere. And then, 2 days later, the hope died. On Sunday, November 19th, two hunters were walking through a dense patch of woods in Johnson County, about 20 miles south of Speedway. It was a remote area. No roads, no trails. Just thick underbrush and fallen logs. The kind of place you'd only go if you knew it was there. They were looking for deer. They found bodies instead. All four of them. Still wearing their burger chef uniforms. Polyester shirts stained with grease and blood. They had been arranged in a rough line, partially concealed by brush and leaves. The hunters ran back to their truck and drove until they found a payphone. Within the hour, the Johnson County Sheriff's Department had descended on the scene. Crime scene tape was strung between trees. Photographers documented every angle. The coroner arrived and began the grim work of examining the bodies where they lay. But the way they had died told a story investigators struggled to piece together. Jane Fried had been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the head. The second shot, the coroner noted, was likely the kill shot. The angle of the wound suggested she'd been on the ground when it was fired. Execution style. Daniel Davis had been shot in the face at close range. The powdered burns on his skin indicated the gun had been pressed directly against him. His eyes were still open when they found him, staring up through the canopy of bare branches. Ruth Shelton had also been shot, but her injuries were less clear. Some reports suggested she had been sexually assaulted before being killed. Others noted defensive wounds on her hands, evidence that she had tried to fight back. Her uniform was torn, her blouse partially unbuttoned. The coroner's report would later confirm that she had been raped. Mark Flemons hadn't been shot at all. He had been beaten to death with a blunt object, possibly a chain or a tire iron. The force used was extreme. His skull had been fractured in multiple places. His face was nearly unrecognizable. The disparity in the methods was confusing. Why shoot 3 and bludgeon 1? Why use different levels of violence on each victim? It suggested either multiple killers with different temperaments, or a single killer who was improvising, who was disorganized, who was losing control. The prevailing theory was that this had started as a robbery. Someone, or more likely 2 people, had entered the burger chef late in the evening, possibly just as the staff was beginning to close. They forced Jane to open the safe. But the amount inside was small, less than $500. Not enough to justify what came next. At some point, the decision was made to take the 4 employees with them. Why? Maybe they panicked. Maybe one of the victims recognized them. Maybe the plan had always been to eliminate witnesses. The employees were likely forced into a vehicle at gunpoint, driven to the remote woods in Johnson County, and executed there. The fact that they were still in their uniforms suggested they hadn't been held for long. This wasn't a kidnapping. It was a quick, brutal disposal. But here's what didn't make sense. If this was just a robbery, why take them to the woods at all? Why not just shoot them in the restaurant and flee? Why leave money in the registers? Why leave the back door open? The scene at the Burger Chef felt staged, hurried, like someone wanted it to look like a robbery, but didn't have time to make it convincing. Detectives worked backward from the discovery of the bodies. The trail went cold. In 1984, a man named James Delaney confessed to the Burger Chef murders while in prison for an unrelated crime. He described the scene in chilling detail: how they had entered through the back, how they had forced the employees into a van, how they had driven them to the woods and took care of them. Detectives were electrified. This could be it. Delaney was brought in for questioning. He was calm, almost casual. He provided details, some accurate, some not. He said they'd used a .38 caliber handgun. He said Jane had begged for her life. He said Mark had tried to run and had to be chased down. But then Delaney's story began to unravel. He got basic facts wrong: the color of Jane's car, the layout of the restaurant, the time of night. He claimed they had used a shotgun, but the victims were killed with a handgun. He couldn't explain how he knew about the crime scene details, many of which had been publicized in the media. Polygraph tests were inconclusive. His co-defendant, a man Delaney claimed had been with him, denied involvement and passed his polygraph. And without physical evidence, prosecutors couldn't move forward. Delaney recanted, said he'd made it up for attention, said he'd read about the case in the newspapers and wanted to feel important. And the case went cold again. What little physical evidence existed was frustratingly incomplete. Ballistics analysis confirmed that a .38 caliber handgun had been used, but the bullets were too damaged to match to a specific weapon. The tire iron or chain used to kill Mark was never recovered. There were no usable fingerprints. The cash register keys had been wiped clean. The safe showed no prints other than Jane's. But there was one piece of evidence that investigators believed could break the case: tire tracks. At the edge of the dirt road near the dump site, forensic techs had found fresh tire impressions. They were photographed, measured, and cast in plaster. The tread pattern suggested a van or large truck, something with wide commercial-grade tires. Detectives cross-referenced the pattern with known vehicles in the area. They identified several possible matches, including a van owned by a local contractor who had a history of violent outbursts. But when they searched the van, they found nothing. No blood, no fibers, no evidence linking it to the crime. The tire tracks remained a dead end. The lingering image. The image that haunts people who study this case isn't the bodies in the woods. It's the restaurant. Picture it. The lights still on, humming softly in the empty dining room. The fryers still bubbling, filling the air with the smell of hot oil and salt. The register standing open, bills scattered on the counter like someone had grabbed what they could and run. And the back door, wide open, swinging slightly in the cold November wind. It's a scene frozen in time. A snapshot of the moment everything went wrong. The moment four teenagers just trying to finish their shift and go home were forced into a vehicle and driven into the dark. You might wonder what they were thinking in those final moments. Whether they believed they'd be let go. Whether they fought. Whether they screamed. The woods where they were found are still there. Overgrown now. The exact spot where their bodies lay is unmarked. But every so often, someone stumbles across it while hiking. And they stop. And they feel it. The weight of something unfinished. Something unresolved. The burger chef murders remain officially unsolved. In 2018, a retired detective named Tim Jarosik reopened the case using modern forensic techniques. He re-examined evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and built a circumstantial case against two men he believed were responsible. One was a former Speedway resident with a history of armed robbery. The other was a drifter who had been in the area in November 1978. Both had died years earlier, one in a prison riot, the other from a drug overdose. Jarosik presented his findings to the Indianapolis Police Department, but without DNA evidence, most of which was lost or degraded over the decades, there was no way to prove it. The families of Jane, Ruth, Daniel, and Mark have long since stopped expecting justice. But they haven't stopped demanding answers. Because somewhere, someone knows what happened that night. Someone saw the van. Someone heard the gunshots. Someone helped dispose of the bodies. And that someone is still out there. Still driving past the spot where the burger chef used to stand. Still keeping the secret. The campfire that burned alone. The mountains. The Siskiyou Mountains are not kind to strangers. They rise along the Oregon-California border in jagged, forested ridges, dense stands of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine that block out the sun even at midday. The terrain is steep, unforgiving. Trails disappear into thick underbrush. Creeks run cold and fast through narrow ravines. And at night, the darkness is absolute. In the summer of 1974, the mountains were a place of escape. Families from the valley towns would pack their trucks and head into the high country for long weekends, fishing, hiking, sitting around campfires under skies so clear you could see the Milky Way stretching overhead. But the Siskiyous had a reputation. Locals whispered about how easy it was to get turned around, how quickly the weather could shift, how deep the silence felt when you were miles from the nearest road. And they whispered about the people who lived up there. Drifters. Hermits. Men who'd come to the mountains to hide from something or someone. It was into this wilderness that the Cowden family drove on the morning of September 1st, 1974, looking for one last taste of summer before school started again. The family. Richard Cowden was 32, a machinist from the small town of White City, Oregon. He was a big man, over 6 feet, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor. He wasn't the kind of guy who talked much, but his co-workers respected him. He showed up on time, did his job, and went home to his family. His wife, Belinda, was 28. She was petite, soft-spoken, and devoted to their 2 children. She kept the house immaculate, packed lunches every morning, and made sure the kids had clean clothes and good manners. Friends described her as gentle, almost timid. Their son, Richard Jr., was 5 years old. A wild, energetic boy who loved trucks and dirt and climbing trees. He'd been talking about the camping trip for weeks, asking his dad 100 questions about whether they'd see bears or catch fish. Their daughter, Melissa, was only 5 months old. She was a happy baby, always smiling, always cooing. Belinda carried her everywhere in a sling, nursing her on demand, whispering lullabies. The plan was simple. Drive up into the Siskiyous near the tiny hamlet of Copper. Find a quiet spot along a creek, set up camp, and spend a long Labor Day weekend in the woods. No agenda, no schedules, just family time. They loaded the truck, a white Ford pickup with camping gear, groceries, fishing poles, and Richard Jr.'s favorite toy dump truck. They brought a Coleman stove, a canvas tent, sleeping bags, and enough food for 3 days. They left White City around 9 a.m., waving goodbye to neighbors as they pulled out of the driveway. No one would see them alive again. When the Cowdens didn't return home by Tuesday evening, Belinda's mother began to worry. She called friends. She called the police. By Wednesday morning, a search was underway. Authorities traced the family's route into the mountains. They knew Richard liked to camp near Carberry Creek, a remote area accessible only by a rough logging road. Search teams drove up into the high country, scanning the tree line, calling out names that echoed through the empty forest. And then they found the truck. It was parked at the end of a dirt spur road, just off the main logging route. The doors were unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition. The camping gear was still in the truck bed, untouched. But the family was gone. Their daughter, Melissa, was only 5 months old. She was a happy baby, always smiling, always cooing. Belinda carried her everywhere in a sling, nursing her on demand, whispering lullabies. The plan was simple. Drive up into the Siskiyous near the tiny hamlet of Copper, find a quiet spot along a creek, set up camp, and spend the long Labor Day weekend in the woods. No agenda, no schedules, just family time. They loaded the truck, a white Ford pickup, with camping gear, groceries, fishing poles, and Richard Jr.'s favorite toy dump truck. They brought a Coleman stove, a canvas tent, sleeping bags, and enough food for 3 days. They left White City around 9 a.m., waving goodbye to neighbors as they pulled out of the driveway. No one would see them alive again. The discovery. When the Cowdens didn't return home by Tuesday evening, Belinda's mother began to worry. She called friends. She called the police. By Wednesday morning, a search was underway. Authorities traced the family's route into the mountains. They knew Richard liked to camp near Carberry Creek, a remote area accessible only by a rough logging road. Search teams drove up into the high country, scanning the tree line, calling out names that echoed through the empty forest. And then they found the truck. It was parked at the end of a dirt spur road, just off the main logging route. The doors were unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition. The camping gear was still in the truck bed, untouched. But the family was gone. Search and rescue teams moved carefully through the area. They found the campsite about 50 yards from the truck, tucked into a clearing beneath towering pines. The tent had been set up. The Coleman stove was sitting on a wooden picnic table, a pot of water still on the burner. There was food laid out: bread, butter, canned beans, as if someone had been in the middle of preparing a meal and simply walked away. Richard Jr.'s toy dump truck sat in the dirt near the fire pit, but there was no sign of struggle. No blood. No indication that anything violent had occurred. It was as if the family had vanished into thin air. For weeks, search teams scoured the Siskiyous. Volunteers came from all over Oregon. Bloodhounds were brought in, following scent trails that led nowhere. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the forest canopy. Divers checked the creeks and rivers, but the mountains kept their secret. Theories multiplied. Some believed the family had gotten lost, maybe gone for a hike and become disoriented. But Richard was an experienced outdoorsman. He knew how to read a compass, how to follow a creek downstream to civilization. Others speculated about animals. A bear maybe, or a mountain lion. But there was no evidence of predation. No drag marks. No torn clothing. No bones. And then there was the darkest theory of all. That someone had been watching them. That someone had approached the campsite. That someone had taken them. But who? And why? The search officially ended in late September. The Forest Service declared the area too vast, the terrain too dangerous to continue. The Cowden family was listed as missing persons, presumed dead, and the case went cold. On April 13, 1975, 2 deer hunters were making their way through a particularly rugged section of the Siskiyous miles from any trail. They were moving along a rocky hillside when one of them noticed something wedged into the base of a granite outcropping. It was a child's shoe. They moved closer. And then they saw the opening, a shallow cave, barely large enough to crawl into, hidden behind a tangle of manzanita bushes. Inside were the bodies, all 4 of them. The hunters scrambled back to their truck and radioed for help. By nightfall, the hillside was swarming with law enforcement. The bodies were carefully extracted from the cave and transported to the county morgue. The autopsies revealed the horror of what had happened. The forensics. Richard Cowden had been shot twice in the head at close range. The caliber was consistent with a .22 rifle, a common weapon in rural Oregon, used for hunting small game. Belinda had also been shot, once in the head. The angle suggested she'd been kneeling or sitting when it happened. Richard Jr., just 5 years old, had been shot in the back of the head. A single bullet. Execution style. Melissa, the infant, had been killed with a blow to the head. The weapon was never identified, but the coroner believed it was a rock or a heavy stick. None of them had defensive wounds. That suggested they had been taken by surprise or forced to comply at gunpoint. The location of the cave was significant. It was over 3 miles from the campsite, deep in the backcountry, accessible only by scrambling up steep, loose terrain. The family couldn't have made that journey on their own, not with a 5-month-old baby. They had been marched there, likely at gunpoint, likely in the dark, and then they had been killed and hidden, their bodies concealed in a place where they might never have been found. Investigators worked to piece together what had happened. The Cowdens had arrived at the campsite on the morning of September 1st. They'd set up the tent, unpacked the truck, and started preparing lunch. At some point, likely late morning or early afternoon, someone had approached. The scene at the campsite suggested the family had been interrupted mid-task. The food was half prepared. The stove was still set up. Nothing had been stolen. Not the expensive camping gear. Not the cash in Richard's wallet. Not Belinda's jewelry. This wasn't a robbery. Whoever had taken them had one goal: to make them disappear. The family was likely forced to walk from the campsite into the mountains. It would have taken hours, hiking through dense forest, climbing over rocks, carrying the baby. Richard Jr. would have struggled to keep up. Belinda would have been terrified. And when they reached the cave, hidden and remote, they were executed, one by one. The suspect. Detectives focused their attention on a man named Dwayne Lee Little. Little was a convicted killer who had been paroled just months before the Cowdens disappeared. He was living in a trailer about 15 miles from the Carberry Creek area, working odd jobs and keeping a low profile. But locals knew him, and they were afraid of him. Little had a history of violence. In 1952, he had shot and killed a man during a dispute over a woman. He'd served time, been released, and then violated parole by threatening a neighbor with a rifle. He'd been sent back to prison, released again, and now, in 1974, he was back in the mountains. Witnesses reported seeing him near the campsite around the time the Cowdens disappeared. One logger claimed he'd seen Little's truck, a faded blue Chevy, parked near the logging road on the morning of September 1st. Detectives brought Little in for questioning. He denied everything. Said he'd been home that day. Said he didn't know anything about a missing family. His demeanor was cold, detached. He stared at the investigators without blinking, without emotion. But there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. No fingerprints on the truck. No fibers from his clothing. No witnesses who could definitively place him at the scene. And the .22 rifle he owned, tested by ballistics experts, didn't match the bullets recovered from the bodies. Little was released. The community reckoning. The revelation that the Cowdens had been murdered, executed in the woods like animals, sent shockwaves through southern Oregon. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't nature. This was evil. Parents stopped taking their children camping. The Siskiyous, once a place of recreation and escape, became a place of fear. Logging roads were avoided. Campgrounds emptied out, And everyone had the same question. Who could do this to a family? To children? To a baby? Dwayne Lee Little's name circulated in whispers. People crossed the street when they saw him in town. Some openly accused him. Others just stared. But without evidence, the law couldn't touch him. Investigators developed several theories. One was that the Cowdens had stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. In the 1970s, the remote forests of southern Oregon were dotted with illegal marijuana grows. Growers were known to be violent, protective of their crops, willing to kill to protect their operations. Had Richard driven the truck down the wrong road? Had the family accidentally hiked into a grow site? It was possible. But no marijuana plots were found in the area. Another theory was that the killer was a drifter, someone passing through. Someone with a rifle and a predatory instinct. The randomness of the crime, the lack of motive, suggested opportunistic violence. But the execution-style killings suggested planning, control. Someone who knew the terrain. Someone who knew where to hide bodies. A third theory, darker, more disturbing, was that the killer had been watching them. That he'd seen the family arrive, seen Belinda with the baby, seen the tent beams set up. And he'd made a decision. This was a chance, an opportunity, and he'd taken it. The case today. Dwayne Lee Little died in 1996, never charged with the Cowden murders. To this day, the case remains officially unsolved. In 2009, a cold case detective named Steve Pickle reopened the file. He re-interviewed witnesses, reviewed the forensic reports, and built a circumstantial case that pointed, once again, to Little. But Little was dead. And without a confession, without DNA, without a murder weapon, there was no way to definitively close the case. The cave where the Cowdens were found has been marked by the Forest Service. It's not accessible to the public. Too remote. Too dangerous. But hikers occasionally stumble across it. And when they do, they say the same thing. The silence there is different, heavier. Like the mountains are still holding on to what happened. The question. You might wonder what the family was thinking as they were marched through those woods. Whether Richard tried to negotiate, to plead, to offer money. Whether Belinda begged for the children to be spared. Whether Richard Jr. cried or stayed silent, sensing the danger. The answers died with him. But the campsite, the meal left half prepared, the toy truck in the dirt, the tent flapping in the wind, remains one of the most haunting images in American true crime. A family interrupted, a family erased, and a killer who walked back into the forest and disappeared. The Alley of Shadows. The desert town. Las Cruces, New Mexico sits in the high desert, surrounded by mountains that shimmer in the heat. In 1990, it was a quiet city of about 60,000 people, a mix of college students from New Mexico State University, military families from nearby White Sands Missile Range, and longtime residents whose families had been there for generations. It wasn't a violent place. Crime was low. People left their doors unlocked. Kids rode bikes through the streets until dark. But on the morning of February 10th, 1990, that sense of safety was shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. And it happened in a place designed for fun. Las Cruces Bowl was a landmark. A sprawling windowless building on East Amador Avenue, painted bright colors, with a massive neon sign out front that read Bowl in red and blue letters. Inside, it was classic Americana. 24 lanes of polished wood, the constant rumble of rolling balls, the crash of pins, the smell of fried food and shoe spray. On weekends, the place was packed. Birthday parties, leagues, teenagers on dates, families. But on Saturday mornings, Before the doors opened to the public, the bowling alley was quiet. Just a handful of employees preparing for the day, restocking the concession stand, turning on the pin machines, unlocking the front doors. On February 10th, 7 people were inside. 4 adults, 3 children. By the time the police arrived, 4 of them would be dead. 3 would be clinging to life, and the killers would be gone. The bowling alley was scheduled to open at 9 a.m. Employees and family members had arrived around 8 a.m. to get ready. Stephanie Sinak, 34, was the day manager. She'd worked at the bowling alley for years and was well liked. Efficient, friendly. The kind of person who remembered your name and asked about your kids. She brought her 12-year-old daughter, Melissa Repass, with her that morning. Melissa often helped out on weekends, sorting shoes, wiping down tables, earning a little pocket money. Steve Tarrant, 26, was the cook. He'd been working the morning shift for a few months. Quiet guy. Kept to himself. He brought his 2 young daughters with him that morning, Valerie, 6, and Paula, 2. His wife was at home with their newborn, and Steve figured the girls could play in the arcade while he prepped the kitchen. Ida Holguin, 68, was a longtime employee. She worked the front desk, handing out shoes and taking payments. She was a grandmother, a fixture in the community, known for her warm smile and her patience with kids. Melissa Repass, Stephanie's daughter, and Amy Hauser, 13, were best friends. Amy had spent the night at Melissa's house and had come along to help out. 7 people, just getting ready for a normal Saturday. And then, around 8:20 a.m., 2 men walked in through the unlocked front door. The men were armed. Handguns, witnesses would later say. They didn't shout. Didn't make demands. They simply herded the 7 people, 4 adults, 3 children, toward the back of the building, into the manager's office. It was a small room. Cramped. A desk, a filing cabinet, a safe in the corner. The men forced everyone inside. Stephanie Sinek tried to reason with them, asked what they wanted, offered to open the safe. One of the men told her to shut up. The 7 victims were forced to lie on the floor, stacked awkwardly on top of each other in the narrow space. The children were crying. Paula, the 2-year-old, was sobbing. Valerie clung to her father. And then, methodically, the men began shooting. Each victim was shot in the head at point-blank range. The gunmen moved down the line, one by one, firing into the back of each skull. The sound was deafening in the small room, sharp cracks that echoed off the concrete walls. Stephanie Sinek was shot. Ida Holguin was shot. Steve Tarrant was shot. His daughters, Valerie and Paula, were shot. Melissa Repass was shot. Amy Hauser was shot. 7 shots. 7 people. All of them lying motionless on the blood-soaked carpet. The killers then set a fire. They piled papers from the desk onto the floor, doused them with lighter fluid, and ignited it. Smoke began to fill the room. They wanted to destroy evidence, wanted to make sure there were no witnesses. And then they walked out, calmly, methodically. They exited through the front door, got into a vehicle, and drove away. But they'd made a mistake. 12-year-old Melissa Repass was still alive. The bullet had entered the back of her head, but by some miracle, it had missed her brain stem. She was conscious, bleeding, disoriented, but alive. She could hear the fire crackling, could smell the smoke, could feel the weight of the bodies on top of her. And she could hear her mother, Stephanie, moaning softly. Melissa dragged herself out from under the pile. Her vision was blurred. Her head was screaming with pain. She stumbled to the desk and picked up the phone. She dialed 911. The 911 call is one of the most harrowing pieces of evidence in American crime history. Melissa's voice is small, trembling, slurred from the head wound. She tells the dispatcher that men came into the bowling alley, that they shot everyone, that there's a fire. How many men? The dispatcher asks. 2, Melissa says. 2 black guys. She describes them as best she can. Tall, wearing dark clothing, maybe in their 20s or 30s. She can't remember much else. The pain is overwhelming. The dispatcher keeps her on the line. Tells her help is coming. Tells her to stay calm. Within minutes, police and paramedics are on the scene. The scene. When first responders entered the manager's office, they found a nightmare. The fire had been extinguished. Melissa had managed to stomp it out before it spread, but the room was filled with smoke. The bodies were piled on the floor, tangled together, soaked in blood. 4 were dead. Ida Holguin, shot in the head, killed instantly. Steve Tarrant, shot in the head, killed instantly. Paula Terran, 2 years old, shot in the head, killed instantly. Valerie Terran, 6 years old, shot in the head, killed instantly. 3 were alive, but barely. Stephanie Senek, shot in the head. She was rushed into surgery. Doctors worked for hours to stabilize her, but the damage was catastrophic. She survived, but she was left with severe brain damage. She would never fully recover, never be able to speak clearly, never be able to care for herself again. The 911 call is one of the most harrowing pieces of evidence in American crime history. Melissa's voice is small, trembling, slurred from the head wound. She tells the dispatcher that men came into the bowling alley, that they shot everyone, that there's a fire. How many men? The dispatcher asks. 2, Melissa says. 2 black guys. She describes them as best she can. Tall, wearing dark clothing, maybe in their 20s or 30s. She can't remember much else. The pain is overwhelming. The dispatcher keeps her on the line. Tells her help is coming. Tells her to stay calm. Within minutes, police and paramedics are on the scene. The scene. When first responders entered the manager's office, they found a nightmare. The fire had been extinguished. Melissa had managed to stomp it out before it spread, but the room was filled with smoke. The bodies were piled on the floor, tangled together, soaked in blood. 4 were dead. Ida Holguin, shot in the head, killed instantly. Steve Tarrant, shot in the head, killed instantly. Paula Terran, 2 years old, shot in the head, killed instantly. Valerie Terran, 6 years old, shot in the head, killed instantly. 3 were alive, but barely. Stephanie Senek, shot in the head. She was rushed into surgery. Doctors worked for hours to stabilize her, but the damage was catastrophic. She survived, but she was left with severe brain damage. She would never fully recover, never be able to speak clearly, never be able to care for herself again. Melissa Repass, shot in the head. She underwent emergency surgery. Against all odds, she survived, but the bullet remained lodged in her skull, too dangerous to remove. Amy Hauser, shot in the head. She also survived, though with permanent injuries. The crime scene was processed meticulously. Shell casings were collected. Blood samples were taken. Fingerprints were lifted from the desk, the doorknob, the safe. But the killers had been careful. They'd worn gloves. They'd left almost nothing behind. The Las Cruces Police Department launched the largest investigation in the city's history. Dozens of detectives were assigned. The FBI was called in. Composite sketches were created based on Melissa's description. 2 African-American men, both in their 20s, one taller than the other. The sketches were plastered on every telephone pole, every storefront, every news broadcast in southern New Mexico. Tips poured in. Hundreds of them. Detectives ran down every lead. They interviewed ex-boyfriends, disgruntled employees, known criminals in the area. But nothing stuck. Here's what didn't make sense. The killers had forced Stephanie to open the safe, but they'd taken almost nothing. A few $100s at most. The safe had contained more, but most of it was left behind. This wasn't a typical robbery. Robberies are fast, chaotic. You grab the cash and run. You don't take the time to march 7 people into a back room. You don't execute them one by one. You don't set a fire. This felt professional, calculated, like the killers had a specific goal. But what? One theory was that the bowling alley was being used as a front for money laundering, and the killers were sent to send a message. Las Cruces sits just 40 miles from the Mexican border. In 1990, drug cartels were expanding their operations into southern New Mexico. Had Steve Tarrin or Stephanie Senek seen something they weren't supposed to? Had they been targeted? Detectives investigated. They found no evidence of cartel involvement. No large cash deposits. No suspicious transactions. Another theory was that the killings were personal. That one of the victims had been the target, and the others were just collateral damage. But who? And why? No one had enemies. No one owed money. No one was involved in anything illegal. The more detectives dug, the less sense it made. In the months following the massacre, several suspects emerged. One was a man named Ronald Senek, Stephanie's ex-husband. He had a history of violence, had threatened Stephanie in the past, and had been seen near the bowling alley on the morning of the shootings, but his alibi held. He'd been at work with multiple witnesses. His finances were investigated. No evidence of hiring a hitman. No suspicious phone calls. Another suspect was a local gang member who'd been bragging about hitting the bowling alley. Detectives tracked him down. He denied involvement. Polygraph tests were inconclusive. Then there was the 2 black guys' description. In 1990, Las Cruces was predominantly Hispanic and white. African American residents made up a small percentage of the population. That should have made the suspects easier to identify. But despite the composite sketches, despite the media coverage, despite the massive reward offered, no one was ever identified. The Las Cruces bowling alley massacre became a defining moment for the city. Parents were terrified. If children weren't safe in a bowling alley on a Saturday morning, where were they safe? The bowling alley remained closed for weeks. When it finally reopened, attendance was sparse. Families stayed away. The building, once a place of laughter and community, felt haunted. In 1999, Las Cruces Bowl closed permanently. The building sat empty for years, a crumbling monument to the horror that had occurred inside. It was eventually demolished. Melissa Rapace carried the bullet in her skull for the rest of her life. She suffered from chronic headaches, memory problems, and PTSD. She struggled to talk about that morning, but she never stopped trying to help the investigation. In interviews over the years, she repeated the same description. 2 men, African American, wearing dark clothes. She couldn't remember their faces clearly. The trauma, the head wound, the passage of time had all blurred the details, but she never wavered on the core facts. Amy Hauser also survived, though she rarely spoke publicly about the attack. She moved away from Las Cruces, trying to build a life beyond that morning. Stephanie Senek never recovered. She lived in a care facility for years, unable to speak, unable to care for herself. She died in 1999, 9 years after the shooting. Her death was ruled a homicide, a delayed result of her injuries. The official death toll of the Las Cruces bowling alley massacre is 5. The case remains open, unsolved. In 2020, on the 30th anniversary of the murders, the Las Cruces Police Department announced they were re-examining evidence using modern forensic techniques. They appealed to the public for new information. But decades have passed. Memories have faded. Witnesses have died, and the killers, if they're still alive, have never been caught. Here's what keeps investigators awake. This wasn't random. The killers walked in with a plan. They knew the layout. They knew where the office was. They knew how to control 7 people without a struggle. That suggests familiarity, preparation. But who were they? And what were they really after? The answer is still out there. Somewhere in the desert. Somewhere in the shadows. Waiting. Waiting. The shadow of the valley. The Connecticut River Valley is one of the most beautiful regions in New England. The river itself runs for over 400 miles, carving a path between Vermont and New Hampshire, flanked by rolling hills, dense forests, and small towns that look like postcards. In the spring, the valley is lush and green. In the fall, the foliage turns brilliant shades of red and gold. It's the kind of place people move to for peace, for quiet, for safety. But in the mid-1980s, something was hunting there. Between 1978 and 1987, at least 7 women disappeared or were murdered along a 60-mile stretch of the Connecticut River Valley. The victims were diverse, different ages, different backgrounds, different towns, but they shared one thing. They had all been alone, at night, in isolated areas, and they had all encountered a man who killed them with shocking brutality. The Connecticut River Valley Killer, as he came to be known, was methodical, patient, and invisible. He struck without warning, vanished without a trace, and left behind crime scenes that told a story of rage and control. Mary Elizabeth Critchley and Kathy Milliken, both college students, disappeared in 1981 while hitchhiking near the University of New Hampshire. Their bodies were found months later in a wooded area, stabbed repeatedly. Bernice Courtmanche, 17, was abducted in 1984 while walking home from work in Claremont, New Hampshire. Her remains were found in a field, her throat slashed. Ellen Freed, 26, was killed in 1984 while jogging near her home in Vermont. She was stabbed multiple times. Eva Morse, 27, was found dead in her home in Charlestown, New Hampshire. In 1986, she had been sexually assaulted and stabbed. The pattern was clear. The killer targeted women who were alone, often in transitional spaces, parking lots, walking trails, rest stops. He attacked at night. He used a knife, and he disappeared. But in 1988, he made a mistake. He left a survivor. On the night of August 6, 1988, 22-year-old Jane Borowski was driving home from the county fair in Keene, New Hampshire. She was 7 months pregnant, exhausted, and ready to get home and sleep. Around midnight, she pulled into a closed convenience store in West Swansea to grab a soda from the vending machine outside. The parking lot was empty. The store was dark. The only light came from a single street lamp casting long shadows across the asphalt. Jane parked near the vending machine, got out, bought her soda, and climbed back into her car. She sat there for a moment, sipping the drink, the engine idling, and then headlights appeared. A vehicle pulled into the lot behind her. A station wagon. Dark-colored. Boxy. Possibly a Jeep Wagoneer. Jane didn't think much of it. Maybe someone else wanted to use the vending machine. But the car didn't park. It stopped directly behind her, blocking her in. A man got out. He walked up to Jane's driver's side window. Tall, white, maybe in his 30s. Dark hair, expressionless. He just stood there staring at her. Jane rolled down her window a crack. "Can I help you?" He didn't answer, just stared. And then he opened her car door. Jane tried to slam it shut, but he was too fast. He grabbed her arm, pulled her halfway out of the seat, and started stabbing her. Over and over. In the chest, the abdomen, the arms. Jane screamed, fought, grabbed at the knife. Her hands were cut open as she tried to push the blade away. But he kept stabbing. She could feel the blade tearing into her, could feel the warm blood soaking through her shirt, could feel her strength draining. And then somehow, she broke free. She jammed her foot on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, tires screeching. The man stumbled back, surprised. Jane floored it. She drove, blood pouring from her wounds, vision blurring. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know if he was following. She just drove. She made it about a mile before she saw lights, a house, windows glowing in the dark. She pulled into the driveway and laid on the horn. A couple came running out. They saw the blood, saw Jane slumped over the wheel, and immediately called 911. Jane was rushed to the hospital. She was in critical condition. The doctors performed emergency surgery. They counted the wounds, 27 stab wounds. Any one of them could have been fatal. But Jane survived. And so did her baby. The description. When Jane was stable enough to talk, detectives gathered around her hospital bed with notepads and sketch artists. She described the man as best she could. White male, 30 to 40 years old, about 6 feet tall, medium build, dark hair, color length, clean shaven, no distinctive features. He'd been wearing dark clothing, jeans maybe and a jacket. And the car, a dark-colored station wagon. Possibly a Jeep Wagoneer. Boxy. Older model. The sketch was distributed across New England. Investigators believed this was the Connecticut River Valley killer. The MO matched. Nighttime attack, knife, isolated location. But this time, he'd left a survivor who could identify him. Detectives poured resources into the case. They canvassed the area. They interviewed everyone who'd been at the fair that night. They tracked down every dark-colored Jeep Wagoneer registered in New Hampshire and Vermont. But the killer had vanished. No witnesses had seen the attack. No surveillance cameras had captured the vehicle. No one reported seeing a man matching the description. The Connecticut River Valley went quiet. No more bodies were found. No more women disappeared. It was as if the killer had simply stopped. Or moved. Over the years, several suspects have been considered. One was Michael Nicolaou, a Massachusetts man convicted of murdering 2 women in the late 1980s. His MO was similar. Knife attacks, isolated victims, nighttime strikes. He was imprisoned in 1988, right around the time the Valley killings stopped. Detectives looked hard at Nicolaou, but he had alibis for some of the earlier Valley murders, and he denied involvement. Another suspect was Gary Schaefer, a serial killer from Vermont who was convicted of murdering multiple women in the 1990s. He'd lived in the Valley during the 1980s. He fit the general description. But Schaefer's victims were all killed in their homes. He was a home invader, not a predator who stalked parking lots and trails. Then there was the theory that the killer was a long-haul trucker. Someone who passed through the Valley regularly, striking opportunistically, then disappearing back onto the interstate. But no solid suspect ever emerged. Jane Borowski gave birth to a healthy baby girl a few months after the attack. She named her Amanda. In the years that followed, Jane became an advocate for victims of violent crime. She gave interviews. She worked with police. She never stopped hoping that someone would recognize the sketch, that someone would come forward, that the man who tried to kill her would be caught. But he never was. Jane passed away in 2016, never knowing the identity of the man who attacked her. The prevailing theory among investigators is that the Connecticut River Valley killer was a local, someone who knew the area, who understood the rhythms of the small towns, who could blend in. He likely lived in the valley, or worked there. He might have had a family, a job, a normal life. But at night, something inside him shifted. He became a predator. The fact that the killing stopped in 1988, right after Jane's attack, suggests one of three things. He was caught for another crime and imprisoned. He moved out of the area. He died. Some investigators believe he's still alive, still out there, still keeping the secret. The Connecticut River Valley is still beautiful, still quiet. But the people who live there remember. They remember the years when women were afraid to be out alone, when parking lots felt dangerous, when every unfamiliar car was watched with suspicion. And they remember that the man who did this was never caught, that he's still out there, somewhere. The fire on Anderson Lane, Austin, Texas in 1991, was a city in transition. It was growing fast. Tech companies moving in, the university expanding, the music scene exploding. Downtown was being rebuilt. Suburbs were sprawling northward. The population was young, optimistic, drawn by jobs and sunshine and the promise of something new. But beneath the growth, beneath the neon and the noise, Austin was still a place where neighborhoods knew each other, where high school kids worked part-time jobs, where Friday nights meant football games and late shifts at the mall. In North Austin, along Anderson Lane, there was a strip of shops and restaurants that catered to families, a grocery store, a pizza place, a video rental shop, and a yogurt shop called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. It was a bright, cheerful place. Pastel colors, neon signs, the smell of waffle cones and fruit toppings. Teenagers loved it. Parents trusted it. But on the night of December 6th, 1991, that trust was incinerated. Literally. 4 teenage girls were working the closing shift that Friday night. Amy Ayers, 13, was the youngest. He was in 8th grade, a straight A student, a member of the church youth group. She'd begged her parents to let her get a job, wanted to earn her own money, wanted to feel independent. This was only her 3rd week working at the yogurt shop. Jennifer Harbison, 17, was a senior at a nearby high school. Popular, outgoing. She had plans to go to college, to study business, to travel. She'd been working at the shop for almost a year, saving money for a car. Sarah Harbison, 15, was Jennifer's younger sister, quieter than Jennifer, more reserved, but just as driven. She played clarinet in the school band. She wanted to be a doctor. Eliza Thomas, 17th, was Jennifer's best friend. They'd known each other since middle school, had applied to work at the yogurt shop together, had planned to room together in college. Eliza was artistic. She drew, painted, filled sketchbooks with portraits and landscapes. 4 girls, 4 futures, 4 families waiting for them to come home. They would never make it. The yogurt shop was scheduled to close at 11 p.m. It was a Friday, so it had been busy. Customers coming in after movies, after dinner, grabbing dessert before heading home. By 10:30, the crowd had thinned. By 10:45, the last customer had left. The girls began their closing routine, wiping down tables, emptying the trash, counting the cash register, locking the front door. At some point between 10:45 and 11:15 p.m., someone entered the shop. How they got in is still debated. The front door had been locked, but the back door, used for deliveries, may have been left ajar. Or maybe the girls let someone in, someone they recognized, someone who seemed safe. No one knows for sure. What is known is that at 11:48 p.m., an Austin police officer driving past the yogurt shop noticed smoke. Officer John Jones pulled into the parking lot. Smoke was pouring from the building, thick, black, billowing into the night sky. He radioed for the fire department and grabbed a fire extinguisher from his trunk. But the flames were too intense. The heat drove him back. Firefighters arrived within minutes. They broke through the front door, doused the flames, and moved through the gutted interior, searching for victims. They found them in the back. 4 bodies, stacked on top of each other in a narrow hallway near the storage room. Their hands had been bound, some with their own clothing, others with strips of fabric. They'd been gagged, and they'd been shot. Each girl had been shot in the head, but they hadn't died from the fire. They'd been dead before it started. The scene was a forensic nightmare. The fire had destroyed much of the evidence. The intense heat had melted plastic, warped metal, and incinerated anything flammable. Water from the fire hoses had flooded the shop, mixing with ash and blood, and creating a toxic sludge that contaminated everything it touched. But investigators worked methodically. They photographed every angle. They collected shell casings, 2 different calibers, suggesting 2 different guns. They found remnants of an accelerant, lighter fluid or gasoline, that had been poured over the bodies and ignited. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a fire that got out of control. This was arson. This was murder. And it was deliberate. The autopsies revealed the full horror of what had happened. All 4 girls had been bound and gagged. All 4 had been shot in the head at close range, execution style. The medical examiner found evidence that at least 2 of the girls had been sexually assaulted before being killed. The bindings were tight, methodical. The killer, or killers, had taken their time, had controlled them, had made sure they couldn't escape, couldn't scream, couldn't fight back. And then, after killing them, the perpetrators had tried to destroy the evidence. They'd poured accelerant over the bodies, set the fire, and walked out, assuming the flames would consume everything. But fire is an imperfect eraser, and investigators were able to recover enough evidence to begin building a case. The Austin Police Department launched the largest investigation in the city's history. Dozens of detectives were assigned. The FBI was brought in. A tip line was established. Rewards totaling over $100,000 were offered. The first question was, why? Was this a robbery? The cash register had been emptied. About $500 was missing. But the shop also had expensive equipment, untouched. The safe in the back office was closed, but not forced open. If this was a robbery, it was a poor one. $500 doesn't justify the level of violence that occurred. Was it personal? Had one of the girls been targeted? Detectives interviewed friends, ex-boyfriends, classmates. They found nothing. No threats, no stalkers, no grudges. Was it random? A crime of opportunity? That seemed most likely. But the execution-style killings, the sexual assault, the fire, all suggested planning, control, intent. This wasn't random. This was purposeful. But what was the purpose? The yogurt shop murders devastated Austin. Parents were paralyzed with fear. If 4 teenagers weren't safe working in a brightly lit strip mall on a Friday night, where were they safe? Vigils were held. Thousands of people attended. The 4 girls were mourned not just by their families, but by an entire city that saw their own children in those faces. The yogurt shop closed immediately. The building sat empty for months, a charred shell, a monument to horror. Eventually, it was demolished. But the memory remained. For years, the case went cold. Tips dried up. Leads evaporated. The evidence, what little remained after the fire, yielded no clear suspects. Then, in 1999, a breakthrough. 4 men were arrested and charged with the murders. Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. All four were in their 20s. All four had been teenagers in 1991, living in Austin, known to law enforcement for minor offenses. And all four had allegedly confessed. The confessions came after hours of interrogation. The men described the attack in detail, how they'd entered through the back, how they'd forced the girls into the hallway, how they'd bound them, shot them, set the fire. It seemed like justice had finally arrived. But then, the cases began to fall apart. Confessions were the product of intense, prolonged interrogations, some lasting over 12 hours. The suspects were young, scared, and in some cases, intoxicated or high during questioning. Defense attorneys argued that the confessions had been coerced, that detectives had fed the suspects details about the crime scene, that the men had said what they thought the police wanted to hear. And when the confessions were analyzed, inconsistencies emerged. The suspects described the interior layout of the shop incorrectly. They gave conflicting accounts of who did what. They couldn't explain how they'd gotten to the scene or where they'd gone afterward. And most critically, the physical evidence didn't match. Forensic analysts had recovered biological material from the crime scene. Semen found on the bodies of two of the girls. In 1991, DNA technology was still developing. The samples were stored, waiting for the science to catch up. By the late 1990s, DNA testing was reliable. The samples were analyzed. None of the four suspects matched. The DNA belonged to unknown males, at least two different individuals, neither of whom had been identified. This was a bombshell. If the DNA didn't match the suspects, then who did it match? Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen were tried first. Both were convicted in 2001 and sentenced to death. But the convictions were overturned on appeal. The courts ruled that the confessions had been properly obtained and that the DNA evidence excluded them as perpetrators. Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn were never tried. Charges against them were eventually dropped. All four men walked free. And the yogurt shop murders were once again unsolved. So if it wasn't Scott, Springsteen, Pierce, or Wellborn, who was it? One theory is that the killers were experienced criminals, possibly adults, possibly with a history of sexual violence. The level of control, the use of restraints, the execution-style shootings all suggest someone who had done this before. Another theory is that the crime was drug-related. In 1991, Austin had a growing problem with gangs and narcotics trafficking. Some speculated that the yogurt shop was being used as a drop point or money laundering front, and the girls had witnessed something they weren't supposed to. But there's no evidence to support that. No drugs were found. No large cash deposits. No cartel connections. A third theory, darker and more disturbing, is that this was a thrill kill. That the perpetrators entered the shop for the sole purpose of committing violence. That the robbery was an afterthought, a way to make it look like something it wasn't. That theory is supported by the sexual assault, the overkill, the fire. These weren't the actions of someone trying to get away with a crime. These were the actions of someone savoring it. In 2009, the Austin Police Department announced they were using advanced DNA technology to reanalyze the evidence. They entered the unknown DNA profiles into national databases. They cross-referenced with other unsolved crimes, but no matches were found. In 2016, they tried again, this time using genetic genealogy, the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer. They hoped to identify the perpetrators through distant relatives who had submitted DNA to ancestry websites, but the DNA samples were too degraded, too contaminated by the fire and water. The profiles weren't complete enough to generate usable leads. The investigation stalled once again. The families of Amy, Jennifer, Sarah, and Eliza have spent over 30 years waiting for answers. They've attended press conferences. They've met with detectives. They've offered rewards. They've never stopped fighting for justice. But the years have taken their toll. Parents have aged. Siblings have grown up in the shadow of the murders. The grief hasn't faded. It's just become a permanent part of their lives. In interviews, family members describe the same feeling. Incompleteness. The story doesn't have an ending. The girls' lives were stolen, and the people who did it are still out there. Still free. The image that lingers from this case isn't the fire or the bodies. It's the yogurt shop itself. The bright pastel walls. The neon sign. The smell of waffle cones and sugar. A place designed to make people happy. A place where teenagers earned their first paychecks, where families stopped for dessert on the way home from the movies. And in that place, on a Friday night in December, 4 girls were bound, assaulted, executed, and burned. The contrast is almost unbearable. The yogurt shop murders remain open, unsolved. The Austin Police Department still has a detective assigned to the case. They still field tips. They still hope that someone, somewhere, will come forward with the piece of information that breaks it open. But as the years pass, that hope grows dimmer. The killers, if they're still alive, are likely in their 50s or 60s now. They may have moved away. They may have died. Or they may still be in Austin, living ordinary lives, carrying the secret of what they did on Anderson Lane. You might wonder how someone could do this. How someone could walk into a yogurt shop, look at 4 teenage girls, and decide to destroy them. The answer is out there. Somewhere in the DNA. Somewhere in the memories of someone who knows. But until that answer surfaces, the yogurt shop murders remain one of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history. A case that shattered a city. A case that stole 4 lives and left 4 families in perpetual grief. A case that, even now, feels unfinished. The storm at Camp Scott. Camp Scott was a place of magic for the girls who went there. Nestled deep in the woods near Locust Grove, Oklahoma, about an hour south of Tulsa, the camp sprawled across 400 acres of dense forest, rolling hills, and clear spring-fed creeks. Towering oak trees formed a canopy overhead. At night, fireflies danced in the dark. The air smelled like pine and earth and summer. It was a Girl Scout camp, established in 1928, beloved by generations of Oklahoma girls who spent their summers there learning to tie knots, build fires, sing songs, and sleep under the stars. In June of 1977, the camp was preparing for its annual summer session. Counselors arrived early to set up the tents, stock the kitchens, and prepare the cabins. The first group of campers, around 140 girls between the ages of 8 and 10, were scheduled to arrive on Sunday, June 12. They came with sleeping bags and flashlights and letters from home. They came with excitement and nervousness and the hope of making friends. 3 of them would never leave. Lori Lee Farmer was 8 years old. She was from Tulsa, a quiet girl with long blonde hair and a shy smile. She loved horses. Her parents had sent her to Camp Scott because she'd begged them. She wanted to ride, to be outdoors, to have an adventure. Doris Denise Milner, also 8, was from Tulsa as well. She was small for her age, with dark hair and bright, curious eyes. She was outgoing, fearless, the kind of kid who made friends easily. She'd been to Camp Scott before and loved it. Michelle Heather Goosey, 9, was from Broken Arrow, a suburb of Tulsa. She was a tomboy, athletic, tough, unafraid of bugs or mud or heights. She was excited to be at camp, excited to be away from home, excited to prove she was old enough to take care of herself. On the night of June 12th, the 3 girls were assigned to Tent #8 in the Kiowa unit, a cluster of canvas tents set far back in the woods, away from the main camp buildings. It was one of the most remote areas of the camp, surrounded by dense forest, accessible only by a narrow dirt trail. The girls climbed into their sleeping bags, whispered and giggled in the dark, and eventually drifted off to sleep. They had no idea they were being watched. That night, a thunderstorm rolled through eastern Oklahoma. It was a violent storm, the kind that shakes the ground, that rattles the trees, that drowns out every other sound. Lightning cracked across the sky in brilliant white flashes. Thunder boomed so loud it felt like the earth was splitting open. Rain pounded on the canvas tents, heavy and relentless. The storm lasted for hours. The counselors stayed in their tents, assuming the campers were safe, assuming the girls were asleep. But someone was moving through the camp. Someone who knew the layout. Someone who had been waiting. And the thunder masked everything. The next morning, Monday, June 13th, a counselor named Carla Wilhite was walking from the staff area to the showers when she saw something in the brush near the trail. At first, she thought it was a mannequin or a prank, something the older girls had set up as a joke. But as she got closer, she realized what it was. A body, small, pale, lying in the weeds. She screamed. Within minutes, other counselors came running. They found 2 more bodies, a few yards away, partially concealed by brush and branches. All 3 girls from Tent 8. Lori, Denise, Michelle. They were still in their pajamas. Their sleeping bags had been unzipped from the inside, suggesting they had been forced to get out. They had been bound, gagged, and then they had been battered and strangled. The violence was extreme. Personal, rage-filled. And their bodies had been dragged from the tent, through the woods and dumped along the trail, a trail used by counselors every morning to walk to the shower. The killer had wanted them to be found. The camp erupted into chaos. Counselors frantically gathered the other campers, herding them into buses and away from the scene. Parents were called. Police were summoned. The Mays County Sheriff's Department arrived first, followed by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. The camp was sealed off. Crime scene tape was strung between trees. Investigators moved carefully through Tent 8. Inside, they found signs of struggle. Sleeping bags overturned. Flashlights knocked over. But there was no blood inside the tent. The killings had happened outside. They also found a red flashlight near the bodies. It didn't belong to the camp. It didn't belong to the girls. Someone had brought it. And they found footprints. Partial, muddy impressions in the soft ground near the trail. Large, adult-sized boot prints. As investigators processed the scene, more evidence emerged. A length of cord had been used to bind the girls. It was cut from a roll of rope kept in a storage shed on camp property, meaning the killer had either stolen it beforehand or taken it the night of the murders. A piece of duct tape used as a gag had been torn from a roll. The roll was never found. And then there was the cave. About a mile from Camp Scott, hidden in the dense woods, was a small cave. Locals called it the Old Caves, a network of limestone hollows used by hunters and hikers. Inside, investigators found disturbing evidence. Photographs of children, some ripped from counselor orientation materials, a copy of a camp layout map, a newspaper clipping about Camp Scott's opening, and a handwritten note. The note was brief, scrawled in block letters. "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in a tent." The note had been found weeks before the murders, discovered by a camp counselor during a pre-camp cleanup. She'd shown it to other counselors, and they dismissed it as a prank. Kids broke into the camp during the off-season sometimes. It wasn't unusual. But now, in the context of 3 dead girls, the note took on a horrifying significance. Someone had planned this. Someone had written down their intent. Someone had been inside the camp studying it, preparing, and no one had taken it seriously. Investigators quickly focused on a man named Eugene Leroy Hart. Hart was a local, born and raised in the area around Locust Grove. He was 33 years old, a Cherokee man with a violent criminal history. In 1966, he'd been convicted of kidnapping and raping 2 pregnant women. He'd been sentenced to over 300 years in prison. But in 1973, Hart had escaped. He'd walked away from a prison work detail and vanished into the woods of eastern Oklahoma. Woods he knew intimately. For 4 years, he'd been a fugitive. Law enforcement had searched for him, but Hart was elusive. He lived off the land, moved through the forests like a ghost, stayed one step ahead of the authorities, and he was believed to be hiding in the area around Camp Scott. The day after the murders, a massive manhunt was launched. Hundreds of law enforcement officers, tracking dogs, helicopters, all searching the forests and hills around Locust Grove. Hart had connections in the area. Friends, family, people who might be hiding him. Investigators interviewed everyone. Searched homes, checked barns, sheds, caves. For months, Hart eluded capture. But on April 6, 1978, 10 months after the murders, a team of Cherokee trackers cornered him in a remote cabin in the Cookson Hills, about 50 miles from Camp Scott. Hart surrendered without a fight. He was thin, bearded, filthy, but he was calm, almost smiling. He told the officers, "I've been waiting for you." Jean Leroy Hart was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The trial began in March 1979 in the small town of Pryor, Oklahoma. It became a media spectacle. Reporters from across the country descended on the courthouse. The community was divided. Some believed Hart was guilty. Others believed he was being framed because he was Native American, because he was an escaped convict, because he was an easy target. The prosecution presented compelling evidence. Hair samples found in the tent matched Hart's. A boot print near the bodies was consistent with boots Hart was known to wear. Witnesses placed Hart near Camp Scott in the weeks before the murders. The cave where the mission note was found was in an area Hart frequented. But the defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial. The hair analysis was not definitive. DNA testing was not yet available. The boot print was common. The witnesses were unreliable. And Hart himself had an alibi. Friends claimed he'd been with them the night of the murders, miles away from Camp Scott. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 days. And on March 30th, 1979, they returned a verdict: not guilty. The verdict shocked the families of the victims. Lori's parents, Denise's parents, Michelle's parents. They had sat through the trial, had listened to the evidence, had believed justice would be served. But Hart walked free. Technically, he wasn't free. He was returned to prison to serve out his original sentence for the 1966 rapes. But he would never be convicted of the Camp Scott murders. 2 months later, on June 4th, 1979, Jean Leroy Hart died of a heart attack while in prison. He was 35 years old. With his death, the case effectively closed. Investigators believed they'd had the right man, but without a conviction, the murders remained officially unsolved. In 1989, forensic scientists re-examined the evidence using new DNA technology. Hair samples, semen samples, and other biological material recovered from the scene were tested. The results were inconclusive. The samples were too degraded. The technology still too limited. In 2008, more advanced DNA testing was conducted. This time, the results were stronger. The DNA recovered from the scene was a partial match to Jean Leroy Hart. Not definitive enough to be considered proof in court, but strong enough to suggest his involvement. Investigators who had worked the case felt vindicated. They believed Hart was the killer. The DNA supported that belief. But other experts weren't convinced. They pointed out that partial matches can be misleading. That contamination was possible. That the DNA alone wasn't enough to close the case. If Hart didn't do it, or if he didn't act alone, then who did? One theory is that Hart had accomplices, friends who helped him, who stood lookout, who helped him move the bodies. Another theory is that the killer was someone else entirely. Someone local, someone with access to the camp, someone who knew the layout and the routines. Some have speculated about a counselor or a camp employee, someone who'd been inside the camp before, someone who'd written the note hidden in the cave, waited for the right moment. But no other suspects were ever seriously considered. The investigation focused almost entirely on Hart. Camp Scott never reopened. The Girl Scouts of America closed it permanently in the months after the murders. The tents were dismantled. The buildings were boarded up. The forest reclaimed the land. Today, the site is abandoned, overgrown. The trails are barely visible. The foundations of the old tents are covered in moss and leaves. But people still go there. True crime enthusiasts, paranormal investigators, locals who remember, and they all say the same thing. The place feels wrong, heavy, like the woods themselves are holding on to something. The families of Lori, Denise, and Michelle have carried the weight of that night for over 40 years. They've watched as the case has been reopened and re-examined and debated. They've read the theories. They've listened to the podcasts. They've seen the documentaries. But for them, the story is simple. 3 little girls went to summer camp, and they never came home. On a stormy night in June 1977, someone crept through the woods of Camp Scott. Someone who had been watching. Someone who had planned. Someone who opened the flap of 10-8, woke 3 sleeping girls, and led them into the dark. Was it Jean Leroy Hart? The evidence suggests it was. The DNA leans that way. But he was acquitted. Was it someone else? Someone who's still out there? Someone who's kept the secret for 45 years? The answer is still buried in those woods. Still hiding in the shadows of the Cookson Hills. Still waiting. Because once you know that something like this can happen in your town, in your bowling alley, your campground, your yogurt shop, you never feel quite as safe again. But here's the thing about unsolved cases. They're only unsolved until they're not. Advances in DNA technology have cracked cases that were cold for 50 years. Deathbed confessions have broken open. Investigations that seemed hopeless. A single tip, one person finally willing to speak, can change everything. Somewhere, someone knows something. Someone saw a car that didn't belong. Someone heard a name they've never forgotten. Someone is carrying a secret that weighs heavier every year. And maybe, just maybe, that person is watching this right now. If you know something about any of these cases, speak. The families deserve answers. The victims deserve justice. And the killers, no matter how much time has passed, deserve to be held accountable. Because the truth doesn't disappear. It doesn't fade. It just waits. In the fields of Illinois, in the woods of Indiana, in the mountains of Oregon, in the desert of New Mexico, in the valley of New Hampshire, in the ashes of Texas, in the storms of Oklahoma, waiting to be found.